The legend of Jimmy the Hammer Jones. Jimmy the Hammer Jones, he was the toughest guy anyone knew. At least that's what Jimmy wanted everyone to think. He boasted about his strength. He bragged about his fearlessness. Jimmy claimed he could wrestle a bear. He wore a leather vest, even on hot days. His laugh could make small children cry. Jimmy was all about building up his tough guy image. One day, Jimmy's friends were hanging out at their usual spot, Sal's Pizzeria. It was a cozy little place with checkered tablecloths and the smell of freshly baked pizza wafting through the air. The walls were adorned with pictures of local sports teams and old movie posters, giving it a nostalgic feel. The group had been coming here for years, ever since they were kids. It was their go-to spot for catching up, sharing stories and, of course, making bets. They were tired of Jimmy's stories. Every time they met, Jimmy would regale them with tales of his supposed bravery and daring exploits. At first it was entertaining, but after a while it became repetitive. The same old stories about how he once saved a cat from a tree, or how he bravely confronted a bully in high school. His friends had heard it all before, and they were growing weary of his constant need to prove himself. So they decided to challenge him. They wanted to see if Jimmy could back up his words with actions. It was time to put his bravery to the test. The group huddled together, whispering and plotting. They needed to come up with a challenge that would be difficult enough to test Jimmy's mettle, but not so dangerous that it would put him in real harm's way. After much deliberation, they finally came up with the perfect dare. "Hey, Jimmy," said Frankie, leaning forward with a mischievous grin. "If you're so tough, spend a week alone in that creepy cabin in the woods." The cabin in question was an old abandoned structure on the outskirts of town. It was rumored to be haunted, and no one had dared to spend a night there in years. The mere mention of it sent shivers down the spines of most people, but Jimmy just raised an eyebrow. 10 days, added Tony, upping the ante, "and you can't chicken out." The group nodded in agreement, their eyes fixed on Jimmy, waiting for his reaction. They knew that Jimmy had a competitive streak and that he would never back down from a challenge, especially one that questioned his bravery. The stakes were high and the tension in the air was palpable. Jimmy, never one to back down, laughed. He looked around at his friends, their faces a mix of anticipation and amusement. "You guys really think a creepy old cabin is going to scare me?" he said, shaking his head. "I've faced worse things than that. 10 days in the woods, piece of cake." "10 days, you guys are on," Jimmy declared, his voice full of confidence. He knew that his friends were trying to call his bluff, but he was determined to prove them wrong. He had always prided himself on his bravery, and this was the perfect opportunity to show them what he was made of. He shook their hands, a confident smirk on his face. The deal was sealed, and there was no turning back now. Jimmy's friends exchanged glances, a mix of excitement and concern in their eyes. They knew that the cabin was no joke, and they hoped that Jimmy's bravado wouldn't get him into trouble. Jimmy thought to himself, 10 days of peace and quiet, this will be a piece of cake. He imagined himself sitting by the fireplace, reading a book and enjoying the solitude. Little did he know the cabin held secrets that would test his courage in ways he never expected. But for now, he was confident and ready to take on the challenge. The next day, Jimmy's friends dropped him off at the edge of the woods. The cabin was miles from civilization, perfect for Jimmy to prove his toughness. They gave him supplies, a flashlight, a sleeping bag, and enough canned beans to last a month. Jimmy swaggered into the woods, whistling a jaunty tune. He felt like a frontiersman, ready to conquer the wilderness. "This is going to be a breeze," he mumbled to himself. The sun set, the woods grew dark. The once vibrant hues of orange and pink faded into deep purples and blues, casting an eerie shadow over the dense woodland. The forest, which had been alive with the sounds of birds chirping and leaves rustling, now fell silent, as if holding its breath for what was to come. The air grew colder, and the first stars began to twinkle in the sky like tiny pinpricks of light in an otherwise impenetrable darkness. The shadows from the trees seemed to reach out like long, creepy fingers. They danced and swayed with the gentle breeze, creating an almost hypnotic pattern on the forest floor. Each shadow seemed to have a life of its own, twisting and turning in ways that defied logic. The trees, now mere silhouettes against the darkening sky, loomed ominously, their branches like skeletal arms reaching out to grab anyone who dared to venture too close. Inside the dusty cabin, Jimmy started to feel a little less confident. The walls, covered in years of grime and cobwebs, seemed to close in on him. The flickering light from an old lantern cast eerie shadows that danced on the walls, making the room feel even more claustrophobic. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and decay, and every breath Jimmy took felt heavy and labored. He could hear the faint sound of critters scurrying in the walls, adding to his growing unease. Every creak of the floorboards made him jump. The sound echoed through the cabin, each creak louder and more pronounced than the last. It was as if the very floor beneath him was alive, groaning and protesting under his weight. Jimmy's heart raced with every step he took, the fear of the unknown gripping him tightly. He tried to move as quietly as possible, but the old wooden boards betrayed him at every turn. Every hoot from an owl sounded like a scream. The haunting call of the nocturnal bird pierced the silence of the night, sending shivers down Jimmy's spine. It was a reminder that he was not alone in the forest, that unseen eyes were watching his every move. The owl's hoot echoed through the trees, a chilling soundtrack to the growing darkness. Jimmy's imagination ran wild, conjuring images of creatures lurking just beyond the reach of the lantern's light. He tried to sing himself a song, but his voice shook so badly he sounded like a scared kitten. The melody, meant to be comforting, came out in broken, trembling notes. Each word caught in his throat, his fear evident in every syllable. The song, once a childhood favorite, now felt foreign and distant, a stark contrast to the oppressive atmosphere of the cabin. Jimmy's voice echoed off the walls, the sound only amplifying his sense of isolation and dread. "It's just the wind," he muttered, trying to convince himself more than the empty cabin. The trees outside rustled and swayed, their branches tapping against the windows like bony fingers. The wind howled through the cracks in the walls, creating an eerie symphony that played on Jimmy's nerves. He hugged himself tightly, trying to find some semblance of warmth and comfort in the cold, dark room. But no matter how hard he tried, the fear gnawed at him, refusing to let go. The wind picked up outside, the pine trees swayed and groaned. To Jimmy, it sounded like someone was whispering his name. He pulled his sleeping bag over his head, trying to tell himself it was just the wind. But what if it wasn't? What if there were wild animals out there? What if there were ghosts? Jimmy started to regret his boasting. He longed for the comfort of Sal's pizzeria, with its bright lights and cheesy garlic knots. Then he heard it, a loud thump from outside the cabin. Jimmy froze. He held his breath. He listened. Another bump, then a scratching sound at the door. Something was trying to get in. Jimmy imagined glowing eyes peering at him through the cracks in the walls. He imagined sharp claws scraping against the wood. He was trapped. Retreat. He couldn't take it anymore. Jimmy grabbed his flashlight and his half-eaten can of beans. He threw open the cabin door and ran. He didn't care where he was going, as long as it was away from that creepy cabin. He tripped, he stumbled, he ran smack into a spider web, which freaked him out even more. All the while, he imagined something chasing him, its hot breath on his neck. When the first rays of dawn lit up the sky, the forest began to stir with life. Birds chirped their morning songs, and the air was filled with the fresh scent of dew on leaves. The tranquility of the scene was in stark contrast to the turmoil that Jimmy had just endured. Jimmy stumbled out of the woods, his legs barely able to carry him any further. Each step felt like a monumental effort, as if the weight of the entire forest was pressing down on him. His clothes were torn, and his face bore the marks of countless branches that had whipped against him during his frantic escape. He was covered in dirt, cobwebs, and his own fear-induced sweat. His eyes darted around, still haunted by the shadows that seemed to follow him. The night had been a blur of terror and confusion, and now, in the light of day, he felt exposed and vulnerable. He had never been so happy to see the back of that pickup truck in his life. The sight of the old, rusty vehicle brought a wave of relief crashing over him. It was a symbol of safety, a promise of escape from the nightmare he had just lived through. His friends drove up, laughing hysterically at the sight of him. They had been waiting for him, knowing that he would eventually emerge from the forest. But they hadn't expected him to look so utterly defeated. Their laughter was a mix of relief and amusement, a way to mask their own fears about what might have happened to him. "So much for 10 days, tough guy," Frankie chuckled. His voice was filled with a teasing tone, but there was an underlying note of concern. They had all made a pact to survive in the wilderness for 10 days, but Jimmy had barely lasted one night. Frankie's laughter was a way to break the tension, to bring some normalcy back to the situation. Jimmy just slumped in the truck, defeated. The adrenaline that had kept him going through the night was now gone, leaving him feeling utterly drained. He leaned back against the seat, closing his eyes and trying to block out the memories of the night. The truck's worn-out cushions felt like a luxury compared to the hard ground he had slept on. His tough guy image was shattered. He had always prided himself on being the strongest, the bravest among his friends. But now he felt like a fraud. The forest had stripped away his bravado, leaving him exposed and vulnerable. He wondered if he would ever be able to regain his friends' respect, but at least he was alive. As the truck rumbled down the dirt road, Jimmy allowed himself a small smile. He had faced his fears and come out the other side. The experience had changed him, but it had also given him a new appreciation for life. He knew that he would never forget the night he spent in the forest, but he also knew that he was stronger for having survived it. If you enjoyed this hilarious tale of Jimmy the Hammer Jones's misadventure in the woods, be sure to give this video a big thumbs up. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more funny stories and crazy escapades. Comment below with the craziest challenges your friends have come up with. We can't wait to hear your stories. Whether it's a wild dare, an epic prank, or a bizarre adventure, we want to know all about it. Who knows? Your story might just be featured in our next video.